From a combat sports company whose rise to prominence was centered around being known for the best fighting the best, it now seems like Dana White privilege, which I'm gonna get into detail later, has taken over fighters like Dracos du Plessis, Magomed Ankalaev, and Arnold Allen, who fought hard to claw their way up the UFC rankings with impressive win streaks. Only for their ranking to mean nothing in a more popular fighter dorms that Dana White privileged to find themselves as the pay-per-view attraction and in turn receive what many argue are undeserved title shots. It's almost as if the UFC is becoming an unscripted WWE, with the popular guys getting the push for a higher ticket gates, which is very apparent as Dana White opens every press conference with a mention of ticket sales and pay-per-view buys, all while never failing to take a jab at his foes from the boxing fraternity, with discussions of the actual fights and fighters only coming after the CEO has mentioned his bottom line. Fans are starting to notice and they don't like it. They feel like they're being exploited by the UFC. I said earlier that the UFC is becoming like an unscripted WWE, so let me explain that everyone knows what WWE is. It is a product for consumption. There are storylines and characters, all written by WWE's creative department to release the tension and anticipation built up by those storylines a wrestling match takes place. The fighting is semi-real, the outcome is predetermined, but nobody complains because we know what it is. Everyone is happy. Now with the UFC, the difference here is that the creative doesn't write storylines for the fighters. Everything is realistic, there are no predetermined outcomes, and the fighting is 100% real. A match between two technically good fighters sells, but it did sell more if there was perceived animosity between the combatants. That's why a great talk is like Conor McGregor did so well in the UFC, because it tells such a good story and could create real or perceived animosity between himself and his fellow fighter. So what happens if the most skilled fighter isn't the most popular? Well, ticket sales and pay-per-view buys will decline and revenue will fluctuate. The company can't afford that. This is where Dana White privilege comes in. There are many scientists who have fallen short due to Dana White privilege. However, for this discussion, I will discuss a few of the latest victims and beneficiaries of the Dana White privilege. Dracos du Plessis has 220,000 followers on Instagram, whereas Khamzat Chimaev has 7 million followers. This has a significant influence on how many pay-per-views are bought. As a result, the UFC is more likely to make main event fights between popular fighters, even if they are not the most skilled and are still unproven at the highest level. Du Plessis had a 7-fight win streak before his fight with middleweight gatekeeper Robert Whittaker, which included victories over notable opponents such as Darren Till, Derek Brunson, and Brad Tavares. Despite criticisms over his fighting style, he became pretty much impossible to ignore. After the UFC's most recent pay-per-view, Dana White to confirm that Khamzat Chimaev has earned the right to fight for the UFC middleweight title, much to the amusement of many UFC supporters, given the somewhat controversial circumstances under which he was granted this fight. To understand this, let's go back to UFC 294, where the Khamzat Chimaev was returned after a year on the sidelines to fight Kamaru Usman, who was not only given 10 days notice for the fight, but was also a former champion fresh off back-to-back losses in a smaller weight class.
As a dejected...
There it is.
No!
Oh my God!
Undisputed welterweight champ! The belt headed to the UK!
We were writing his obituary!
To the now welterweight champion Leon Edwards, who himself will soon have to defend his title to another beneficiary of Dana White privilege. So one must ask themselves, how does a fight between an unranked fighter and a twice-defeated former champion amount to a title shot? The UFC markets itself as the best of the best, but in reality, it's often the most popular fighters fighting each other, with the UFC somehow orchestrating a title into the mix. Dana White seems to dodge all questions related to Dragos, and fans are upset about that fight. Even current middleweight champion Sean Strickland said, "The only thing I like about Chimaev visiting, he sells fights for some reason. People like him or don't like him. I don't know. To me, he's a paycheck. He sells a lot of fights people paying to watch, but he hasn't earned it, doesn't deserve it. But here we are. It doesn't deserve it, and getting a decision with a welterweight off the couch is not earning it. The UFC had to ultimately U-turn their decision to give Khamzat the title shot because he suffered a torn ligament in his fight with Usman. A situation that has now reopened the door for the number 2 ranked du Plessis to finally get a shot at the title. Dana White's favoritism has been around for a long time. Brock Lesnar is a prime example. Despite having only one professional fight, the former pro wrestler was given a co-main event spot at UFC 81 against heavyweight legend Frank Mir. Even though there's no loss, he was back in a title fight just 1 week later. Paddy, the Buddy Pin Blitz, bringing an already vocal fan base from his time as a champion and staff for the UK-based Cage Warriors promotion, is another fighter who has been accused of receiving special treatments from Dana White. Template's favorable treatment includes receiving high-profile fights and opportunities such as main event slot against Jared Gordon at UFC 292 after only 3 fights in the UFC. After 3 rounds, the consensus was that Gordon should have had his hand raised, so when the judges' scorecards are read in favor of Piglet, people will stand with Jared Gordon, saying he was robbed after the fight.
Okay, yeah, that's a little bit suspicious.
Template even went on record to say that people trying to say, "Oh, it's because he's Dana's boy." How am I Dana's boy? He came on my podcast. I'm not his boy. I'm just a fighter on his roster. People say he influences judges. He can't. But what if someone deserves the Dana White privilege? Conor McGregor helps take the UFC to the next level as becoming the organization's top pay-per-view draw, generating record-breaking sales with electric personality and pre-fight antics. McGregor headlined events such as UFC 202, 205, and 229, which shattered previous sales records. McGregor's charisma and knack for self-promotion propelled him, and by extension the UFC, into the mainstream.
This is so
Of
good.
course, they think I'm toast, Ariel, but I'm still the bread.
His presence attracted new fans who might not have otherwise been interested in MMA. Oh, and by the way, if you're enjoying the video, make sure you subscribe. McGregor's blockbuster fights generated significant financial growth for the UFC. His ability to sell tickets and merchandise, as well as attract sponsorships, helped to increase the UFC's overall revenue. This was especially beneficial for the UFC because McGregor was winning. They became the first UFC fighter to hold 2 championships simultaneously in 2016, winning the featherweight and lightweight titles. McGregor began to lose UFC fights in 2016, starting with a second-round submission last and Nick Diaz at UFC 196.